the questions that I've had received, they're going to be big topics. So that's why, even though an hour for questions, Q&A, I'm going to cover the topics in depth to the best of my ability. So in saying that, we're going to get started. So of course, the first question is probably applicable to everyone, and it's very simple. And it says, some tips for navigating the extreme highs and lows of energy and emotions. So obviously it's about this time. So some tips about how we handle the emotional fluctuations, right, of energy and emotions. So the reason why I put this question first, because it's a simple question. So it's a nice question that's applicable, but it also helps me introduce my take, I guess, on how I see emotions and how I talk about emotions and mental health and things of this nature. So I'll start with that. So the word emotions in Chinese medicine, which I'll talk about in a sec, but in general, we all know that the word emotions really can be divided into emotion or energy in motion. So really it's about movement, yeah? And if you look at the Chinese word for depression, for example, right, because it could be in emotions of depression, you're looking at constraint, stagnation, right? And one of the characters of the word depression is heart, the heart radical, so it obviously means disheartened. But the key of it is the constraint or the stagnation. So when we say energy in motion, we're talking about movement. But the word actually in Chinese, right, translates as, and then again, I don't speak Chinese, I don't read Chinese, so obviously I learn from people who do, but obviously I interpret it and then apply it to my understanding of the emotions, so don't take me literally. But the emotions in Chinese, the translation has the heart radical, but also has the explanation of blue-green color of life or around life, especially around a plant kind of thing growing. So it's about growth. There's actually nothing inherent or inherently negative about the character of emotions in Chinese. So that's interesting, because when we think of emotions, we think negative generally, more often than not, especially for the layman, so for the non-practitioners, where when we talk about emotions, we always think of it in terms of something negative. However, there is no evidence of anything negative inherent in the word emotions in Chinese medicine. And obviously most of you guys are Chinese medical practitioners or of some sort, or a practitioner, but we have some non-practitioners here, so I'm going to watch the language in a bit. So anyway, we've got the blue-green color, or the richness of the vegetation of life. In other words, something from the ground going up towards, from the earth, going up towards where? Well, it can only really go towards the heavens. And everything in Chinese medicine is about heaven and earth, and of course man consolidated or suspended in the middle, so to speak. So if it means to then grow out of this rich vegetation, right? So we're not growing out of mud. I mean, we are, the plant's growing out, but the significance is that we're growing from a rich blue-green vegetation, which is nutrition, right? Which means the emotions that we experience must have meanings. So when we say the energy in motion, yes, it's about moving the energy. So when an emotion comes up, we have to move with it. How do we move with it? Well, if you look at the body physiologically, when we process emotions, one of the primary ways of doing it neurologically is to bring contextual meaning to the experience of the emotion we're having. So I'll get to the up and lows in a sec, but I really want to make this clear. So there's a couple things. Emotions are energy in motion, so movement, but it also has the heart and the richness of life. So in Chinese medicine, regardless of which element is being affected with the emotions, so for example, we say generically joy for the heart, and we say pensiveness or worry for the spleen, the stomach, the earth. We have sadness and grief and a bit of worry for the lung, metal. We have fear for the water, kidney. And then of course we have, the usual things that we put up with, which is anger and irritability and frustration, mild depression, melancholia, mild anxiety, all these things for the wood, for the liver. But for you to feel the emotion, so if I'm feeling fear, yes, we can see it's the kidney, but in order for me to actually sense the perception of fear, the heart has to be involved. So the heart, the Shen, is always involved with all the emotions. Now, so that's why the word basically emotions has the heart in it, and of course the richness of life. If it's the richness of life, it's about meaning. So your brain can bring meaning to emotional experiences based on content and context. So why is that important? When we say something about our past and emotional incidents that happened, and we generalize and we say something like, well, my wife always does this. My husband has always been rude to me. My dad always did that. My mom was never there for me. So when we're saying these things, we're generalizing because we're creating what's called labels. And so because we're creating labels, and these labels are generally absolute labels, always, never. So he was never there for me. He was always rude to me. He was always violent. He never supported me. She never supported me. These are labels, okay? So when you bring contextual meaning to the experience, both content and context, the brain can bring meaning to it. When you can bring meaning to an experience of the emotions, you can move it, energy in motion, right? But when you generalize using absolutes, your brain can't distinguish it because it's an absolute model of black and white. So why is that important? So watch this. When we perceive things from our external environment, we're using our senses, yeah? Touch. Our senses are governed by our emotional brain, our limbic brain. So every time we react or respond emotionally to something, we are perceiving the event. Generally, if it's painful, which emotions generally, if you're going through lots of ups and downs and volatilities, which I'll talk about, you're having a lot of volatilities, your perception is seeing the event as concrete, black or white. That's why you say, he was always mean to me. She was never there for me. He was always late. She never supported me. He was verbally abusive all the time. This is not true. This is because you are creating a label and a generalization. If you get to the moment and not generalize, then the emotion can be neutralized because you bring in content and context to the emotional experience. Then you can move the emotion. So why would we have these? The question was some tips for navigating the extreme highs and lows of emotions and energy. So we have emotion high and emotion low proportionate because the neurology is trying to bring you back into center. So watch this. If this is the mean, the center line, and you have above and below, the center line in mathematics is called the mean, which is the mean average of, right? So the mean average of. So the word meaning means the mean average of something. So when I said you got to bring content and context to the emotional experience for it to be neutralized, it's because your psyche is trying to bring it to average, which is the average mean of the experience. So when you have a high or a low, you're going into above the high, above the mean is high infatuation, and below the mean is low resentment. But these are proportionate. So the higher you're infatuated, it's because you despise something opposite it. So if I love something about a person, for example, that they are always on time, at least one thing that I love about a person is they're always on time. So my infatuation about their time management is because I have a resentment because I hate the fact that people are late, or maybe I was late, so therefore I'm exacerbating the infatuation. So we have a high infatuation and a low resentment. So we have high and low. Or we have a high elation and it's proportional to a low deflation. We have a high attraction because we have a low repulsion. This is all proportionate. And the intensity of the high and low is because for every position you create what's called an opposition. So if I create a position above the mean over here, the intensity of that position is because it's contraindicated from the opposite, which is the opposition here. So the position creates an opposition. So everything that you love is because you despise its opposite. And everything you despise is because you love its opposite. Now, if you're not centered, if you're not in the mean, you're going to have highs and lows. And the reason why you're having a high is because you are trying to avoid its opposite. And the reason why you're having a low is because of the opposite. Okay? So you are resentful to maybe your ex because whatever they did to you. And the reason why you're resentful is because you're infatuated to the opposite of what you resent. Okay? And so when we have fantasies about how life should be, people or events, that fantasy is only because of its correlating phobia, which is a nightmare. So the fantasy and a nightmare, an elation and a deflation, infatuation and resentment. So you have highs and lows, highs and lows. Now, Chuang Tzu basically said, and I'm just paraphrasing here basically, that to understand that we can't do or control the outside world, right, and to remain centered as we would with our destiny, that is from a man of virtue. So I'm very much paraphrasing the meaning of it. The Neijing basically says, when we are understanding the patterns of the Tao, which is basically the principles of nature and also the law of self-cultivation, and we pattern ourselves to the laws of nature, yin and yang, complementary opposites. This is what I'm explaining, opposites. When we pattern ourselves to the laws of nature, yin and yang, then we have Tao, we have the balance. Chuang Tzu also said, for those who want, in the heaven and earth, for those who want order without disorder, do not understand the principles of heaven and earth. So in our own medicine, this is written, the mean is over here. When we want the world to be a certain way, we will constantly be reminded by its opposite. When we're constantly down here, we're going to be constantly reminded by its opposite. So you have a life wish over here because you're infatuated, and you have a death wish over here because you're resentful. So you're going to have highs and lows. So what we want to do is we want to stay on the mean. So we can hover a little bit. Obviously, we're human, so we're going to hover, but we just don't want to do this. So if you're trying to control the current times with COVID and you're despising it, well, it's something outside of your control. So what do we do when we can't control this event? We change our meaning to it. When we change our meaning to it, we can neutralize it. And by neutralizing it, we're dropping the charge from the infatuation, and we're bringing up the charge or the negative charge from its resentment. So we're staying centered, humble, grateful for the experience. Now, I'm not taking away some of the pain that you might have had, the conflict. I can't go and change that. But what I can do is I can help you define the meaning behind it and change your attitude towards it. So that's how we manage our highs and lows. So every time you have a high, it's because you're infatuated by running away from its opposite. So you're avoiding its opposite. So every time you run away from a predator, it's because you're seeking a prey. Every time you have a prey, it's because you're running away from the predator. And these are the two primordial fears in the human body. We're trying to avoid that which can eat us, and we're trying to seek that which we can eat. So we get the prey and predator. It's polar opposites, isn't it? So again, the black and white thinking, I perceive things in my senses as black and white. That's a lower animal mind thinking. You're going to have a lot of highs and lows here. If I perceive things conceptually, not concretely as black and white, but conceptually as gray, I have oneness. When I have oneness, I'm with the Tao, heaven. So heaven is the oneness, right? So the concept of the Tao, the Wu Ji, the Tai Chi, and then of course everything else all the way up to the 10,000 things. It's how we manifest. So you can't have yin without the yang. You can't have yang without the yin. So you have polar opposites. So you have what's called the synthesis and synchronicity of polar or complementary opposites intermingling. When it does that, we don't have too many highs, we don't have too many lows, and we're centered. All right. I know it's a long answer. That's why I said I'm going to cover these in depth. That was the first question. How do we know how deep to treat if the emotion is very low? I'm not really sure exactly what that means. So I'm just going to guess. And if you're on here, the person who asked this question, you can correct me or maybe clarify the message of it. So I'll just read out the question again. It's how do we know how deep to treat if the emotion is very low? So one thing that I really, really trust, of course, and I'm sure you as a practitioner might as well, is the body. And the body is very, very intelligent in how it handles events. So if the question means emotion is very low, as in like severe depression, suicidal, if that's what you're saying, and then the question, so how do we know how deep to treat, say, someone who's really, really low? In my personal observation experience, I've been in practice for 19 years, but I've been working with emotions and mental health for about probably 7-something years solid. That's all I treat in clinic. One of the key things is to center and ground. So we're basically focusing on earth. Not all the time, but many times we want to try to center and ground the person. Now, there's different ways of doing it based on pathomechanisms, of course. We're not just going to guess and speculate. But if someone's very, very low, again, if you use this model, the severe need of being that low is because this person may have a fantasy of the high. And if they're not going to get the high, they're going to go low, okay? So the polar opposite again, the position has an opposition. So if I'm in a relationship and I'm infatuated to all the characteristics of this person, right, my partner, then I'm going to also resent losing that. So I'm infatuated that she's gorgeous, caring, respectful. Well, that infatuation is because I resent those opposites, right? Not caring, not respectful, ugly, basically, right? And so when you go through the infatuation phase towards an event or people, you're soon going to get more resentful because the psyche is trying to bring you back down. But if you're really down, so if the emotion is very, very low, you got to first help get the client to understand that they have an infatuation to its polar opposite. And until you can clear this up, it's going to be very hard to get them out of this, okay? Or if they're up here, they're going to be emphasizing in the bottom. So when you have a phobia, you're going to attract a philia, which is the fantasy. So nightmare and fantasy, right? So working for someone by grounding them, like the Ren Mai points are quite good, for example. So grounding them basically means that you are allowing them to be centered in themselves before you can uplift them. There's actually another question next, and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to relate it because it's about the Dai Mai. And it's a very similar thing about working with the Dai Mai on the 8 extra channels, right? If we're bringing something from a very low point, it might be hard for the client, the patient, the individual to process what may come out. So that's why I'm saying we've got to focus on helping them ground. Interesting that I said Ren Mai, it's not always the case, but the word Ren, as in Ren Mai, actually means not just conception, it also means responsibility. Because a mum, for example, needs to take the responsibility of another human being for 9 months and for the rest of their life. But if you're not responsible in your life, what makes you think you're going to be responsible for another human being? I've just got a comment, one sec. I think you're answering my question as to how to read the body. Yes, you're answering it. Refer the lectures. Okay, yeah, good. So I'm on track. It's the person who asked the question. So we're going to talk into this, and we're going to talk into the Dai Mai in a sec. I'm going to get into the 8 extras. So yeah, the Ren Mai, for example, means not just conception, sea of conception, but it also means responsibility. Okay, and it also means about someone else. Like there's two in the equation. So if you're not able to take responsibility in your own, how can you take responsibility for someone else, another human being? So the concept of grounding and settling means that they have to be somewhat prepared to experience the byproduct of a treatment of something coming out. So now I'll lead to this next question, which is about the 8 extras a little bit. So it says, treatment of the spleen and Shen calming points versus Dai Mai and Chong Mai. Okay. So in all my clinical observation, it's very minimal that I feel I need to use calming Shen points. And this goes a little bit against what we know about Chinese medicine, because this concept of calming the body or calming the Shen is a little bit too general, right? It's too generalized, and it's a little bit of a safety measure when we maybe we're not completely clear on what to do. And don't take that personally, I'm just being general here on observation. So calming Shen, what I've noticed is people in extreme emotional turmoil don't necessarily need to calm Shen. They need a transformation. And you can't get a transformation by keeping them calm. Okay, so Carl Jung said, enlightenment is not by imagining figures of light, it's by going inwards and bringing light to your own darkness. So going in and bringing light, shining light to your own darkness. And that's a little bit hard for people to do. So when you do spleen and stomach points for the grounding, that's great, because I'm saying you're going to keep them grounded. So now let's work to the difference between the Dai Mai and the Chong Mai. You can use them together, right? So this is going to be general because I don't have the client in front of me. I need more actual patterns of disharmony, but just a little bit about the Chong and Dai. So the Chong basically is the root creation of everything. It's the source of creation. So Li Shizhen basically said is the avenue of the great pre-heaven. And the great pre-heaven basically is the Chong, which gives birth to the Ren and Du. So the center, before it splits into yin and yang. But the yin and yang is still integrated and kept whole via the Chong. I just kind of want to maybe see if I can draw this or something. Just give me a sec. So if you can see that, so that center line of the yin and yang, you can imagine that center line essentially as Chong. So the books, Nanjing says basically the great thoroughfare. I believe it's Nanjing, could be Nanjing. The great thoroughfare, because Nanjing has a more complete study of the 8 extras. It's a little bit more scattered in the Su Wen and Ling Shu. But it's the great thoroughfare. Okay, so this goes into the center. It shares the channels in the center and then spreads into the Chong. So the Chong is the center between its split into complementary opposites. So the Chong keeps you grounded as well, right? By going back to your state of original nature. It's the great avenue of pre-heaven. In pre-heaven, you are limitless and full of potential. It's only in postnatal life when we are clouded by judgments, because our postnatal Shen basically is our senses and feelings. So just a little bit on that, and then I'll continue. So we have what's called the root Shen, right, which is the Ben Shen in Chinese. And this is not necessarily talked about really in the Neijing, but it is in some other books. And it basically says the Shen of Shen and the no Shen of Shen, right? So you can think of the root Shen as the ancestral energies and information of your past ancestors, in kind of like the collective consciousness. And then you have the initiating Shen, and this is covered in the Chinese medicine psychology book that was recently released in Australia here, I think. And so you got the initiating Shen, which is at the time of conception, and it sort of brings the information of the ancestral information into the utero at the time of conception. And then it also helps the cognitive aspects of the growth of Shen in utero. And then, of course, you have your postnatal Shen, the She Shen, which is based on the molding and behavior of you looking at your surroundings. So your familial, your teachers, your friends, you're adapting to your postnatal situations. So the Chong is right on the origin. So when you do a Chong treatment, it's essentially connecting the person to the greatest source within themselves before the division split into yin and yang, Ren and Du. Because Ren and Du is yin and yang, so you have two complementary polar opposites. Now with Dai Mai, because Dai basically is the girdle, right? The belt, the girdle, it means when you're working with a Dai Mai, it's a collection of unconscious material, theoretically, if we're looking at emotions, right? By the way, the 8 extras, there's not a lot about the emotional side of what I'm talking to you about on the 8 extra books, because there just isn't really. So we're sort of interpreting a little bit. I'll just come back to these questions that I'm getting in a sec. So anyway, so the Dai Mai is basically a collection of unconscious baggage, right? And so when you're working with that, it's going to try to process that. Now, there's 2 different kind of theories on this, because one theory, which is the consolidating channel of the Dai Mai, and then also the actual standard regulatory channel of the Dai Mai. So the regulatory channel of the Dai Mai goes from basically the liver 13 into gallbladder 26, 27, and so on, whereas the consolidating Dai Mai is around the belly all the way to Do 4. Now, theoretically, that is to hold emotions, and the first original channel, as it goes down, and to squeeze, it squeezes, the energy is to squeeze, is trying to squeeze emotions out. So I don't really follow that philosophy of consolidating emotions and letting go of emotions, because I kind of trust the body in terms of what it needs to do. Your brain can't really bring out emotions if you're not ready to handle the truth, okay? So all accomplishment is possible in an authentic soul. If you're emotional and it's too much baggage for you to handle a pain, your brain won't bring it up for you to process that. It's a superficial, it's a survival mechanism. So if you're working with a Dai Mai, you're essentially trying to bring emotions from a deep level that's been held there. And those might be a little bit painful. So maybe doing these earth points, for example, might be good to contain it. And one of the teachings of, if you look at Jeffrey Yuan's teaching, one of the teachings is to, when you're trying to process these emotions out of Dai Mai, something like working with a Ren Mai might be good, because Ren Mai is also about self-containment. So you've got to keep the person safe as they process these emotions. So anyway, that's a long story, because I've got a whole 3-day workshop on 8 extras if you're interested, but that's a different story. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. So the Dai Mai energy goes inwards. Yes, the channel goes down, but the energy is inwards because it's squeezing it out. Now, when you're holding emotions in the Dai Mai, for example, because it gets processed and siphoned from the chest, heart, your heart has never been tainted in Chinese medicine, okay? It's only the pericardium. The protective barrier, the pericardium siphons the material of emotions, especially these painful emotions, from the chest channel of the Dai Mai. The Dai Mai is not just around your waist. It's in the waist, it's in the chest, and it's got a circumference, right? 3 levels. And the Dao Bao siphons the emotion from the pericardium and pushes it down the Ba Mai into the Dai Mai. When it goes into the Dai Mai, it doesn't touch the Ren and Du, because it doesn't want to take it back into your original yin and yang. Okay, it keeps it in the Dai Mai. So when you process it, it's going to bring things out. So that's why it's good to do a bit of like maybe Ren Mai or some spleen and stomach points to keep them ground and centered. So just before, I hope that answered the question. Just before I go to the next question, I'll just read these comments. So, okay, Danielle, I hope that answered your question. And I have a client preparing first IVF in 6 to 8 weeks due to unexplained infertility. Her blood substitution very high prolactin reading. Apart from the recommended methods to reduce prolactin, I want the yin and Tang affect the pitch. Okay. I'm going to have to get back to this question, Anne, because I've got these questions to go through first. And if I have time, I'll come back to these. Pauline, you talked about transforming emotions rather than calming Shen. Yes, when you transform emotions, how do you prepare the client for what to expect? Well, I'll answer that one because that's relative to the question. So if you look at the controlling cycle in Chinese medicine, basically the curse cycle. So you've got the generating cycle, which feeds and nourishes, and then you've got the controlling cycle. So what would say control? Anger. Obviously, if you look at the curse cycle, it's metal, so it's obviously going to be sadness, controls the anger, for example, or fear controls too much joy, for example, and so on. You know that's the basic curse cycle of things. When you're looking at transforming emotions, how do you prep the client for it? Here's the thing. So this is, I guess, a little bit of the different, or probably a big difference between me and some of the practitioners I've worked with or seen in my seminars is I trust the body to bring out the information for me to then guide the client, right? So obviously I'm not some sort of psychologist or counselor, but Chinese medicine and psychology and Shen is a big part of our system. So when I do a treatment, I gauge the response and then help guide the response more than the actual thing I'm doing in the treatment. So if someone's, for example, fearful and I'm treating for fear, and let's just do some Dai things, for example, just for the sake of this example, and then out of the fear, then the person gets angry. So theoretically, on the generating cycle, the fear is now generating anger. Well, which one is the emotion? So in this scenario, the transformation of fear into anger, but then why is the anger coming out? Where is that coming from? And if we look at the primary source, which is the fear, well, what's inside the fear that's expressing the anger that they're too scared to talk about? So because they coherently can't talk, because after the generating cycle, you've got the heart, and the heart is the tongue, right? So anger is somewhat normal to express, but you are incoherent and you're shouting and screaming, then there's an information that we're missing in the fear response. So we got to get back to the root and see where that is. So basically what I'm saying is the client's gauging out the things that's coming out is what's going to help you understand and how to interact and how to engage the client with understanding the transformation of it. So the response is pretty powerful, and that's what I'll be looking for, and I hope that makes sense. Danielle says, yes, that's great. That was a very new client, depressed, highly medicated. I'm going to talk about medication in, or maybe it's the same question. I've probably separated two, but I'll be talking about depression and medication soon, Danielle. Highly chaotic, huge achievements to leave the house, etc., and sacred to transform, scared to transform. Yeah, I'll get back to that, okay? All right, let me go to the fourth question. So we're 40 minutes in and I'm only up to question 4. I'm really curious as to how you would suggest dealing with delusional states in dementia if they are discussing people whom they've already passed over as if they are still alive. All right, well, this is interesting because dementia is a different topic, and then discussing people, it's as if they are discussing people whom have already passed. So if we have dementia, but we're discussing people that we have cognition of who have passed, right? So I don't know what you want me to do. We can't really talk about dementia, so to speak. Let me just try to talk about the concept of talking about the people that have passed. And because you're saying delusional states in dementia, but then you're also saying people have already passed. I'm not sure if that's delusional, if they have memories of people who have already passed. Now, that the fact that they think they're still alive, I understand that. But so that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so it's not about the dementia, so to speak. It's about talking about someone that's not there. So this in our medicine, Chinese medicine, but also in the Western concept, we're obviously talking about grief and the letting go. So this is a pretty big topic, but you got to bear with me. I've got to try to keep it narrow in this question. So when we're talking or trying to help people now, if they can't consciously communicate because of dementia in terms of what's happening, and we're looking at treating them, then we're potentially going to be working on transforming the Po. So a little bit about this, okay? So when we are born, we essentially have the Jing, the essence, the Qi, and of course the Shen. And what governs the Jing, the Qi, and the Shen, the three treasures, is the Po. So the Po basically is the organizational facility of the physiological mechanisms of the body. And the energy of the Po is basically up and down. Because at the time of death, generally, the Po will leave the anus, according to traditions, and go into the earth. And so when it goes into the earth, the Po also carries with it untranscended material, according to Chinese medicine. So when we're speaking of people who have passed, but we're presuming them as alive, it's because we had an emotional attachment to the people and we haven't been able to process or transform or liberate. Now, that's interesting because the person has passed, but we are talking about it. So we're essentially suspending their Po in different dimensions, and we haven't been able to liberate that or have them liberate that. And so the Po is not being able to transcend. And so in order to work with the person who's, I guess, has dementia, we're trying to tap into the Po to help them transcend the holding pattern of the Po that they're suspending on the person they can't let go. And I've got to just keep it there because it's a very big topic. I have a whole module on grief on one of my workshops, so I'm just trying to keep it narrow. So grief is a physical attachment. It's normal. I'm not saying it's not good. It's normal. But extended, where there's a lot of symptomatic response, it's because we have a physical attachment to the physicality of the person or the individual. And you can have grief on your job. You can have it on your pets as well. You can have it on an object. So we're physically attaching to the object. Now, when we do that, it's going to suspend their po in transcending, and it's also going to keep us in emotional bondage, right? So with the physical connection to that is not very healthy, because the yin and yang of the lungs, one of them is about binding, right? The yin is the binding, and the yang is about expanding. So while you're trying to bind, the yang is trying to expand beyond the bind. And this is going to cause the liberation. So if you work on the po, it should help, and the lung, theoretically, because you can do the back shu points like the po, the outer gate, or you can do some points on the metal channel, for example. You can try to, the binding, you want to expand beyond the bind. So when you expand, you look beyond the bind, and therefore you're free and liberated. So we're essentially working with the po, and I hope that answers that question. Okay, next question. Am I alone in this? After more than, this is Heiko's question, the best. Am I alone in this? After more than 30 years in practice, am I just in this field to feel my own ego and self-esteem? When I have a busy week and get results, I feel good. When I get lots of cancellations and not get any results, the self-esteem goes down. So essentially the question is about the self-esteem and the ego. And so when you're busy, you feel good, and when you're not busy or not getting good results, you feel down. It's a pretty good question, actually, because I'm sure we've all been there, right? So here's a couple things. I'll answer that second part first. When we don't get good results, our self-esteem goes down. So there's a thing called, it's not a thing called, there's a really powerful statement, and it goes like this. Please remember this. Healing transcends technique. I'll just say it one more time. Healing transcends technique. When we are healing, the client is more important than our technique. When we are systemizing our technique for the client, we don't get the results, then we get entrapped by that and we feel crap, because we're prioritizing the system of healing and not the actual healing. So it's a little bit off topic, but it's very important. Healing transcends technique, number one. Number two, your job is to literally plant the seed of healing, but it may not be your job to sprout the healing. This took me a very long time to learn this lesson. So if I'm trying to heal someone and they don't get healed and they move on, maybe to a different practitioner, and I get all weird about that, for example, that's because I'm too attached to my systems and myself and less about the client. Heiko says it's cutting in and out in New Zealand. Sorry, Heiko, this is your question. Hope you get it in the replay maybe. So anyway, so healing transcends technique. So our job is to plant the seed of healing, but it may not be our job to sprout the healing for the individual. It might be some other practitioners. It may not be their time. There's another statement that says there is time for everything and everything in time. It may not be their time, okay? So to get the results, yeah, of course, we can feel concerned to see where we've gone wrong, maybe where we can help. But it's also important to understand maybe it's not their time to heal, number one, right? And also maybe that what makes you think that not getting the results is not their healing. So many times, most of my clients working in mental health and emotional health almost always get worse. Now, if you look at the books, so all the top shelf, there's just the top shelf is the thick ones. Some of them is like the Psyche, from Machacha Psyche one, and there's another one from Rossi and the Shen book and all this kind of stuff, or the golden one from Machacha. If you look at the Psyche section in them, there's all these formulas and all the acupuncture points and herbs for all these different kind of psychiatric kind of emotional stuff. And you and I would probably agree, guys, that it never ever works to the exact same degree, right? So that's because it's not a system. Everyone's individual. So that's the thing I've learned. Sometimes the transformation that comes up is more painful, but that's actually when healing is taking place. But when I go and calm them down, right, and my thing I say normally here, don't take this the wrong way, is if I do 4 gates and yin tang to calm them down, I'm getting in the way of that healing process. That's why I said transformation is what they need, not relaxation. Transformation, not relaxation. And the next step about your thingo is when you're when you're busy, you'll feel good, and when you're not, you feel down. Yeah, that's kind of like a high and low. Okay, so when you're busy because you're empowered, you're doing what you love, you're busy. But when you're down, there's a greater purpose behind it. In business, every time you're down, it's the universe or the market telling you that there's certain things in the business model that's missing. So instead of just waiting around for clients, which I'm not saying you're doing, but if you're just waiting around clients feeling crappy about yourself, you're not really working purposefully, which means there's things missing out of your business model. So what I would say is when you're feeling down, you got to see what areas of your business needs your attention, okay? And also if you're having a lot of ups and downs, then there's actually a break in your ability to get clients, no disrespect. Because if you're not sustaining it, then there's something missing, of course, and therefore you would probably look at marketing. Now, if you're talking about in COVID times, it's kind of understandable. So what can you do to bring meaning to the experience if you have less clients? What else can you do? So one of the most important things is you got to adapt to nature, right? So what is everyone doing at the moment? They're doing what I'm doing. I'm talking to you online, whether you're talking to family on Zoom or you're attending webinars or you're doing webinars, right? This is what clients need from you. So you could have different avenues ready for clients to tap into you. And so if you're not doing that, you're not adapting to the market. The share price of Zoom skyrocketed during this COVID time. The share price of Afterpay skyrocketed in this COVID time because people are buying, shopping online. So they're putting things on Afterpay and people are constantly on Zoom doing things like this. So where are we adapting to the environment? And if we're not adapting, that's probably why you're having a lot of these ups and downs. And because you're emotional with it, you're not being very productive with it. So see where you can actually fulfill the areas that you are missing. I hope that answers the question. I've got to keep going. So next question. Current day youth and mental health leading to procrastination, anger, ego, jealousy, self-harm. So I'm not sure if I've written the whole thing, but basically it says, what are my thoughts on the current day youth, so the young ones, and mental health leading to procrastination, anger, ego, jealousy, and self-harm. So part of my talk today is I'm going to be talking a little bit about gut psychology as well. And I'm not sure if I should talk about that now or later. Maybe I'll leave it because I've got to talk about some depression as well later. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about ADHD because this is a little bit relevant to the youth. It's not just in the youth, but it's somewhat relevant. And of course, there's procrastination is a big one. And then, of course, there's emotions of anger and ego. It says jealousy and self-harm. All right, so attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADD, attention deficit disorder. There is no attention deficit disorder. Watch this. I have attention for you, and I'm focused on you right now, okay? If I wasn't interested in this webinar, but I had to do it, I would probably be like this, right? Or like this, or talking very softly like this, or maybe looking around like this. So watch this. You have attention surplus order when you are focused on something that you value and prioritize in life. You have attention deficit disorder when you're doing things that are lower on your values and have no priority in your life. So attention deficit is not good. It's attention different. So you're different to the values that you're seeing and then incongruent to your values. One of the key aspects of attention deficit is either lack of discipline at home or a lack of adaptability by teaching institutions in terms of education and teaching. So when a teacher, for example, this is not everyone, of course, I'm not generalizing this, but it's highly likely that in today's time, the youth, for example, the reason why I have some of these issues, first at school and I'll talk about after school, is that when we're not congruent to the current ways of getting taught, teaching methods, when we're not congruent with that because our values are changed, we're going to experience attention deficit. So the teacher looks at you not paying attention and therefore they label you and then they call your parents and then you go and see someone GP or something and they give you Adderall or Ritalin, right? And now you're stuck in this thing. So you get amphetamines, for example, to give you that boost, for example. Now, this is in school, right? But what's happening in other times when we're procrastinating, we're anger, jealousy, a lot of us are on social media, right? Or a lot of us are using tablets. So the amount of times we're constantly doing this, for example, we're stimulating information in our brain. The stimulation is creating heat. The heat is exacerbating the liver. The liver is causing the anger, okay? And then, of course, when we're so stimulated by novelty of experience, when we're looking at these things, right, we can literally just pick up the phone and Google an answer to anything we want in a matter of seconds. There's no longer left any novelty in the experience of searching for something, looking for something, exploring something. So we have become impatient. And so therefore, when we're impatient, that obviously arouses these anger, irritability, and all this kind of stuff. The jealousy is because you forget what you are bringing to the table. Because of social media, right? We're constantly on Instagram, for example, and how many people on Instagram, how many times have you heard a story of these high influencers of Instagram either committing suicide or actually being depressed? Because they're constantly comparing themselves to a fantasy of what they want to be looking like in their own profile. So jealousy means you are too busy comparing yourself to someone else, and you're forgetting what you bring to the table for the transaction between two people. And the procrastination basically is because there's two types of procrastination. There's good and bad, right? So when your good procrastination is when you're procrastinating on something that you have least value on, you have no desire for. I always procrastinate on cleaning because I don't do it. I would procrastinate on working in the yard because I don't like it, right? I procrastinate when I have to cook because I have to cook. Every time you say the words I have to, I should, I better, I ought to, it's already signaling that you're working to your lower values, the things that have lower meaning priorities. When you say I love to, I can't wait to, I desire to, I'm inspired to, I'm motivated to, then you're working on your highest values. So I'll procrastinate on lower value items in my life. That's good procrastination. And bad procrastination is when you're going towards your dream and aspirations and goals, the things that you love, and then you procrastinate. That's bad procrastination because you're too afraid to go after the challenges that's going to inspire you and aspire you to something great. And that's what's happening. The self-harm is a different topic. It's a little bit of a big topic, right? It's also part of the question of mental health. Self-harm, more in my experience, more than ever, is about attention. If I'm cutting myself or hurting myself, right, physically and emotionally, you can be self-harming, but I think we're talking about self-harm in terms of sacrificing and cutting and all this kind of stuff. It's really about trying to bring us out of the numbness of our existence. We're so numb. When we're numbed down, whether it's through psychiatric drugs, which I'll talk about, or we're just numbed down because we have withdrawn, we have no feeling, sometimes we hurt ourselves to bring us back up to feel that we're still alive, but it's also generally to get some attention as well. So when people have had this in the past, one good quote that I've read somewhere, I can't remember who it was, but when people have harmed themselves or cut themselves, and you see that, you can say something like, I can see that you were trying to heal. So theoretically, they're trying to heal, but that's the best way they know, because it's the way to get them out of the existence of numbness. They're completely withdrawn. And most of the time they can't feel, especially on mental health drugs, right? There's something that I'll talk about in a sec. So sometimes we do that to ourselves because we want to awaken ourselves from the experience of numbness and being zombie-like, but it's also because it's the only way we know possibly to heal ourselves from the pain. But I can't talk about that because it's a very, very big topic, and I hope that makes sense. All right, next question. How to quieten the mind during meditation, lack of focus mainly. This is a very good question. It's very common. I'm sure you would agree. So I always, when I do these seminars, I always talk about meditation at some point. And I always tell people, most of them practitioners do meditation. I say, what does meditation mean? Unfortunately, not many people actually understand the word, the actual word, what it means and what it comes from. The word meditate from Tibetan philosophy means to bring to awareness. To bring to awareness. Okay. So unfortunately, what I've noticed from my observation is a lot of people go into meditation long term to avoid the awareness. So they're trying to escape their awareness. So that's number one. So I need to bring that up. So meditation is to bring to awareness things that are trapped within so that you can resolve them. Your psyche is so powerful, it's trying to help you liberate from emotional baggage. It doesn't want to hold any emotional baggage, right? One of the things that William James said, my father of modern psychology, said one of the best attributes of human beings is their ability to change their mind, is the ability to change a situation by changing their mind. I'm paraphrasing, right? And so when we adapt by bringing things to awareness instead of running away from them, every time we run away from them, we're going to run into them, right? Every time we try to resist something, is going to keep persisting. You've heard that before in psychology. So first of all, it's to bring things to awareness so that you can bring light and meaning to them. Now, the actual question says how to quieten the mind. Well, this depends on your technique, of course. Meditation is different kinds of meditation. But the reality is, according to neuroscience, you can't really just quieten it and that's it, okay? You can obviously get very good at it, okay? But the whole point is not to just completely eliminate your thought pattern. And the reason why is because it's impossible. How you do it, though, is by becoming more emotionally stable yourself, by raising your emotional quotient. If you have a low emotional quotient, which means stress and your environmental things really stress you out, and you have a lot of these high fluctuations up and down, you have a lower emotional quotient because there's brain noise. So every time the external world, their noise is greater than your internal world, you've become a slave to the external world. But when your internal world is greater than the external world, you become a master of your world, okay? So once you're a master of your world, there's less brain noise and the brain can quieten down a bit. But the reason why many people have trouble, many people have trouble trying to quiet down the noise is because they have a lot of imbalanced emotional charges on past events, and it's just constantly noise. And so that noise is an intelligent response for you to deal with it. But most of the time we want to escape it through meditation. So obviously practice and technique works and different ways of doing meditation. But one thing to understand is it's not random by chance. There's probably underlying meanings of imbalanced emotions that you haven't completely dissolved and neutralized. I hope that answers the question. Okay, how to get control on negative thoughts, especially concerned to health leading to endless worries. Let me just read that one more time. How to get control on negative thoughts, especially concerned to health leading to endless worries. Well, this is similar to what I was talking about. So a lot of people try to avoid negative thoughts, and it's futile for you to do that because it's impossible. The only thing you can get better at is to actually maintain the structure of your thoughts by doing things that you absolutely love, higher value tasks, and also liberating yourself from past emotional baggage. When you're holding on to emotions from the past, something is financing that holding pattern. In your body, in Chinese medicine, that's called Jing essence. So your essence is essentially holding that, which essentially is your marrow, which is your immunity. So your immune system is basically holding everything you've stored away in the past and haven't dissolved, and you're living day to day going forward, right? But still being pulled back to all these different things you've left behind. So all the negativity from your past get transferred to your future because negativity is the phobia, and you're producing more of that phobia into your future because your brain is trying to get you to escape your past, but in your future. Because you have about 75,000 thoughts every day, of which about 95% are repetitive. So negative thoughts are imbalanced perceptions of your past, future directed onto your future. But because the brain doesn't know the difference between real or imagined, right, it puts it into your future, and you have this constant negativity. And here's one of the biggest mistakes. Many people journal negative memories or negative things. So as soon as they feel negative, they just journal it. I think that's a mistake, because when you journal negativity, your brain has this function of encoding negative memories or negative beliefs because of survival. It literally encodes it into neural pathways. So when you're journaling it, you're further enhancing the encoding pattern of it. It's even harder to encode positive things because your brain is about survival. Your life is most of the time lived by default, not by design. Okay. Daniela Kinsella says, anxiety is just excitement without the breath. That's very good. Exactly. I'll talk about that in a sec, actually. So when we're projecting from the past to the future, we have an exaggeration from our past that hasn't been dissolved, and we're constantly moving forward with phobia to avoid the future, and that future is a representation of the past. Now, what Daniela was saying about anxiety, that's basically anxiety. We have the past, which is depression. We have the future, which is fear. Anxiety is rooted in fear, so you can't get anxiety without fear. So the fear is in the future. In the past, you have depression. So in the middle is anxiety, because anxiety is a way for your body to bring out some sort of symptomatic response, to bring your attention to present tense, to say, let go of the past, say, liberate, and don't speculate in the future. So anxiety is actually your body's mechanism intelligently to get you to be centered and present, because that's the only time you have. You can't have anxiety without fear, and you can't have fear of the past. You can only be in the future. So fear is future orientated, and fear and faith have the same meaning. They're both about something in the future. I fear I'm going to be dead tomorrow, or I have faith I'm going to be alive tomorrow. It's your choice. You have the power of choice. So this is what happens. So negativity, don't encode it by journaling it. One of the things in neuroscience says that for every negative thought, come up with 3 positive thoughts. Okay. And when you do this, you're going to change the meaning and impact of what it actually means to you. So instead of doing a negative journal entry, you're better off doing a gratitude journal entry every night to the things that you're grateful for that happened to you during the day. I do it generally in the evening, but sometimes in the morning. So when you're grateful for what you have, that's a different story. Gratitude has been shown to release immunoglobulin A, which is the primary defense against bacteria and viruses. So it enhances your immune system. It enhances your electromagnetic signature out into the field, and you tap into people who are in a state of gratitude, or people come towards you in a state of opportunity because you understand you're centered and grateful. So you can't get rid of negativity just by trying to get rid of it. You got to bring meaning to it, and you got to dissolve it by bringing meaning to the emotional experience of your past, basically. So all emotions are fragmentations. Emotions are fragments. Means the information is half true. Emotions are fragmentations because the information in the content of the experience is half true. Why is it half true? Because you haven't brought meaning to it. When you bring meaning to it, it becomes love. So when you can say thank you and I love you to your past, then you can be liberated and you can be free. Unless you can do that, you'll always be emotional bondage and in baggage to your past. And that's not a very good way of living life, because it's not going to be productive to your health and your life. So I hope that answers the question. Next question. Can you share your experience in treating patients with negative thinking, self-harm? We kind of just did that, actually. Natural supplements. I'll talk about that in a sec. I have had the patient, his stressful New York environment. All right, this is, I think, a question that came up before. Let me just check this. Okay, Danielle's question, similar to that one. Maybe I've got this one. Highly chaotic, huge achievements to leave the house, etc., and scared to transform. Huge achievement to leave the house and scared to transform. This was a very new client, depressed, highly medicated. Okay, so I don't know if this is the same thing we're talking about here, because I've got here, it says, I've had the patient change his stressful new work environment, which helped, but it's still struggling with negative death thinking, whether his self-esteem, ego is affected. I wonder, did acupuncture bring anything up to surface? I don't know how to approach this, but let me just see this one. So I'll talk about depression, and hopefully I'll answer the question among this next topic. I've got this other question. It's quite long, but I'm just trying to summarize it. It's really about depression. So I'm going to talk about depression and depressant medication and things like this, and supplements and gut all in one. So I'll finish it off with this. It might take a bit of time, but I'll finish it off here. So the word depression, remember, is in Chinese medicine is really about constraint, okay? And also the hard radical obviously means disheartened. But ultimately, depression is a comparison problem to a fantasy that you have about how the world or a person should have been like. So any incongruency between the fantasy that you had about an event, the world, or a person, and when those people or that event is not meeting the fantasy that you had in your head, that's basically depression. Depression is putting people up on a pedestal, and anyone that's up on a pedestal is above you. And if they're above you, that means you're below them. So when you sacrifice yourself in proportion to them, you go into depression. It's an intelligent response from your body to help you to become aware of your actions that are actually not serving you. Now, you can say I've been depressed because I let go of my work. You can say I've been depressed because my girlfriend broke up with me or something 9 years ago and I haven't recovered. That all makes sense. But the same concept, when you put something up here, you resent its loss. So when you're infatuated above the mean, the infatuation means you have what's called a life wish. And a life wish means you resent its loss. Because when you lose what you're infatuated with, you don't come back to the median, you go below it because of the same intensity. The same high will take you to the same low. So if you're high over here, you'll probably go low over here. If you're high up here, you'll probably go low down here. So the intensity of the infatuation means you're resenting its opposite. So when the person leaves you or when the job fires you, it breaks your fantasy, and that's what pushes you into depression, okay? But depression has many other assets and facets apart from just this. I do a whole module on depression on one of my seminars, but I'll just try to summarize it for you. So the first thing is a lot of depression has various similarities, especially in females in my observation, with hypothyroidism. So a thyroid function, right? A low thyroid function. So if we look at the emotional side, the thyroid embryologically came from the same muscle tissue as the tongue, right? And so the voice, the articulation, the communication is important here. So hypothyroid is a lack of thyroid function, and the thyroid is right next to the voice box. So the psycho-emotional, metaphysical component of depression in hypothyroidism is a lack of voice. So every time you hold your voice back because you're scared of someone else or because you're comparing yourself to someone else, you're going to go into depression. That's one thing. Depression also has a strong similarity to the symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency. So when you're looking at the symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency, some of the symptoms correlate. So sometimes it's just the B12 deficiency. So when you have something like B12 deficiency, you're basically increasing and enhancing the receptivity of the information from the synaptic gateways between neurons, okay? So the information gets passed quicker, and so the central nervous system gets more optimized, in other words. That's another thing. One more thing is depression is strongly related to vitamin D deficiency. So this is a bit of a topic, and I'll try to summarize it because it's a bit complicated, but yep, I'm just trying to read here. I'll get back to those questions, and if I've got time. Tina says, so Sohial, when is the book coming out? Thank you. Hopefully soon. I've got one book out, but that's more the psychology of business, not really the emotions of business. So that might help, but not on this yet. Okay, so now, so watch this, the gut. The gut's very important, yeah? We know a lot about the gut. Back in the 1700s, one of the founding fathers of psychiatry said, insanity, from his observation, he said insanity is generally linked and comes from the areas around the stomach. This is in the 1700s, mid-70s, the father of psychology, can't remember his name, psychiatry, sorry. He said the insanity comes from the areas around the stomach. That's interesting because in Chinese medicine, a lot of these emotional manic types is generally a yang ming problem, right? So some of these big formulas, such as like Chai Hu Jia, Long Gu Mu Li Tang, and all this kind of stuff, is for those excessive types to bring it down. Now, so that was one person. But in 1840, there was only one classification of mental health, and it was insanity. In 1880, there was 7. Okay, so that was the time basically when the American Psychiatric Association was developed, and there were 7. A couple of other ones where things like mercury poisoning was included, for example, alcoholism, for example, was included, mania was included, next to insanity, things of this nature. In the 1950s, the first division or the first edition of the Diagnostic Statistics Manual of Mental Health, basically the DSM, came out in about the 1950s. And obviously now there was a lot more. There was about 100 and I think 12. 1968, there was the second edition of the DSM that came out. There was 163 or something mental health cases. And this kept going basically. Every time they released a different edition of the DSM, they added more and more mental health cases. And remember, in 1840, there was only one, which is called insanity, right? So in the 80s, there was over 200. In the 90s, there was way more, right? So now it's like edition 5 or something, or 4 plus, and so on. And there's probably over 400 different classifications of mental health. Now, the most important thing here is if you look at the history of this, in 1987, Prozac was released. So obviously one of the most popular anti-depression medication drugs. So in the late 80s, the Prozac was approved by FDA, right? And in 2000 and early sort of 2000, actually in the late 80s, the Prozac was released, and about 5 years later, the American Psychiatric Association basically did a survey, and they realized that 75% of consumers believe that most of these mental health issues are because of chemical imbalances in the brain. Yet in 1984, so coming way back down again, in 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health released a statement that said that elevations and decrements in the functioning of serotonergic activity or of serotonin basically does not play a big role in depression. And if you go into 2000, early 2000, I think it's 2001, one of the presidents of the association basically were saying that the whole concept of mental health is not just moral weakness or imagined and illusional. It's due to actual chemical structural changes in the brain. And anyway, and then 2011, I think it was, or 2001, something like that, early 2000s, Ronald Pies, co-editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, June or July edition, basically said this whole thing about chemical imbalances and mental health or depression is really more so just like I can't remember the term he used. It was just kind of like a vague term, like it was more just like I just missed the term. Anyway, it was so basically he's saying that the chemical imbalance theory, right, was like a folk story. It wasn't really that significant, even though they planned it out that all these things about mental health was due to chemical imbalances in the brain. Now, after Prozac was released, in 2 decades, skyrocketed levels of depression, and 35 times more mental health disabled children increase as well. And mental health disability is really more in terms of mental health for kids. So a lot of kids have issues around mental health, and that's their biggest challenges. When the world went from using fat, lard, to vegetable oil and burning vegetable oil and cooking, that's also the same time that a lot of ADHD cases got diagnosed because the trans fatty acids compared to standard fatty cells, they were incongruent, different shapes. And so trans fatty acids have 51 day half-life, whereas normal standard fat cells basically had 18 half-days, 18 days half-life. And so it stayed in the body longer. And so trans fatty acids destroys or interrupts the DHA in the brain. So coming back to the depression and vitamin D, for example, and the gut and all this stuff, when you have a bad gut, we know that about 80 to 90% of serotonin is in the gut. So serotonin is from tryptophan, which is obviously coming from 5-HTP, right? And so the conversion from 5-HTP to tryptophan, right, and then serotonin, that is transcriptionally done with the amount of vitamin D in your system. and also the amount of essential fats. So watch this. EPA and DHA, right? EPA is the functioning of the central nervous system. DHA is the structure. The executive function, which is the frontal lobe. So when we are depressed, we become withdrawn, we lose our insight, right? And when we lose our insight, we lose our judgments, and we have inattention and low empathy and all this kind of stuff. We're not using our executive function. The majority of the frontal executive function of the brain is DHA. DHA is the structural component of that part of the brain. So EPA releases or helps release serotonin presynaptically, and DHA helps attract it in the receptors postsynaptically. And how many of us have a deficiency of essential fats, for example, and how many of us have vitamin D deficiency? 1 in 3 people have vitamin D deficiency. When we have microbes and our probiotic and our microbiota is not very healthy, right? Generally because of things like glyphosate, as you would know, which basically washes off our microbiota. This plays a huge role in our gut in terms of serotonin and all this kind of stuff. And one of the biggest issues is also, of course, is these hydrogenated vegetable oils, for example, and all these kind of things that's creating a lot of trans fatty acids and it's getting in the way. So in the gut, when we have vitamin D deficiencies, for example, that's not going to help the conversion from the 5-HTP to tryptophan into serotonin. So we're already low. So we need to make sure our gut is really good. Now, other things, for example, sugar depletes lithium from the brain. So a lot of these depressions are also because of too much toxicity from things like aspartame or sugar and things of this nature. In terms of TCM, like Chinese medicine, of course, we need to look at the patterns of disharmony. But you're looking at, for example, generally the liver's always involved in depression because the liver's function of the free flow of energy is really important, in particular the ascension and the expansion. So when the liver can't go up, so from liver 14 and it can't go up, this is called the gate of hope, remember? Gate of hope. And it goes up the energy through the lung, into the throat, into the vertex, right? This is the hun leaving the body upon death, for example. So the ascension of liver means that if we can't go up, we come down. So we resign back in, so we contract. So when we contract, that part, the liver 14, for example, gets stagnant. The stagnation in that level puts a pressure on the diaphragm. The diaphragm becomes inflexible. When the diaphragm becomes inflexible, we have no breath. We can't push chi or energy in, so we can't bring in life and push it down to grasp from the kidneys, right? Because the flexibility of the diaphragm is inhibiting that process. And this is also what's causing things like sighing and procrastination and things of that nature. And so the expansion is also the aspiration. So the hun is about a horizontal energy going out into the world to help you come expanded from the contraction of the po. So both the po and the hun are also complementary opposites, right? The po is the thing that's going to take you down, and the hun is the thing that's going to come and take you up. So when we die, the hun comes and goes out into the heavens, and the po comes out from our back and goes back into the earth. So that's why depression is generally around the liver, but it's not only in the liver, but it plays a big role in making sure that we are not carrying a lot of these stagnations in the liver. So anyway, coming back to the whole gut thing. So lithium, for example, gets withdrawn out because of sugar. Sugar also depletes B vitamins, white flour, white products, white rice, white cakes. All these things deplete B vitamins, which we need for our central nervous system. So all these things are very, very important. And when it comes to depression medication, which is one of the questions here. So here's the thing. So generally speaking, I'm not a psychiatrist, a disclaimer, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist, but I study it and I research it. And of course I work with mental health, so I get to observe it in my clients. All my clients are almost seeing psychologists, psychiatrists, and things of this nature. So I get to learn from them. So most drugs will cause cognitive brain injuries. You don't have to take my word for it. I had the book the other day. I put it up on the post on Aki Guys. Peter Breggin, who was a psychiatrist who's going into most of his career's legal battles to win people's cases because of all the damage from psychiatric drugs. It's Peter Breggin, his name is. You can check him out. And so he talks about the fact that pretty much all psychiatric drugs create what's called chronic brain injuries or cognitive brain impairment. And basically the few symptoms of this is cognitive disempowerment, right? So you lose focus, insight, and you lose your executive function and judgment. So that's called cognitive disempowerment, right? You basically lose memory and concentration, so your focus goes down. You lose your emotional warmness, right? So you have emotional disempowerment, so you become less empathetic, so you become less emotionally responsive. But the most important thing is a thing called anosognosia. And this is where people on medication actually believe they're getting better, and that's actually one of the symptoms of this chronic brain impairment or injury. And this is one of the things I observe when people especially go through the changes in dosage between medication. This is a very big topic. I do a big module on this, but I can't really do it justice here. But it's very, very important to understand that the notion of mental health, there's no real story behind diagnostic features of it rather than just behavioral and characteristics of the stuff. Because I just told you the history was chemical brain imbalance, and that wasn't really true. So you got to do a bit of research on that. But anyway, so most of these drugs cause cognitive disempowerment, memory problems, right? Emotional disempowerment, so withdrawal, I'm not interested, I lose all my creativity and all this kind of stuff. And then, of course, anosognosia, which basically means that I don't even know that I'm that bad because obviously there's an injury to my cerebral function. Now, in terms of getting off it, this is not my role, of course, because I'm not a psychiatrist. But what I do is it's very, very important if you get a good psychiatrist, they can help you with this. But I'm pretty confident in my ability to help clients process emotions, and that helps them in return. So I never really focus on the actual medication. I focused on actually the transformation, and that they themselves make decisions to leave, because I'm bringing awareness to what they're trying to avoid. So most of the mental health is because they're trying to avoid the reality of a situation they've been through, okay? So when you're trying to avoid it, the reality, you're going to be suspended by it at the same time. And so the dosages has to be very, very small. But again, I can't talk about this as a disclaimer because it's not my role. When it's in clinic, it's slightly different, but I'm not a psychiatrist. But what I do know about it is that it has to be in very small amounts, and you have to always support the earth. It's very important to support the earth when someone's coming from the mental health drugs, okay? Because a lot of the newer depression medications cause a lot of psychotic behavior and mania. And the problem is when this happens, then they give them antipsychotic drugs, which is even worse. And so most psychotic episodes actually come from the newer versions of antidepressant medications, right? And so then they get diagnosed with antipsychotics, and then they get more drugs, and it's just a bit useless. So when we focus on the earth, we try to ground them as they come off, and then obviously help manage their symptoms and emotional transformations. So it's a big topic, but I'll go through this in one of the modules because every drug, like, SSRIs work on obviously serotonin pathways. Antipsychotics basically work on dopamine, and benzodiazepines work on GABA, all these kind of things. But one of the key things of depression, for example, is just simple exercise, movement. Exercise increases BDNF, brain-derived neuroprotective factor, and exercise is actually the most scientifically researched part of the most enhancement of BDNF. I think it's 400% with high-intensity interval training. Why am I telling you this? Because chronic stress induces chronic stress basically creates a restriction or inhibition of BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. So chronic stress inhibits BDNF, right? And exercise enhances it. And curcumine, right, blocks that inhibition in depression. That's why curcumin is basically found to be replacing a lot of these drugs. But anyway, that's another big thing as well. It's about movement, because remember, the Chinese word is about constraint. So we want to move through the depression. That's why when you go for exercise, you always feel better. Okay, so anyway, that's it, guys. I got to stop because it's been an hour and a half. I know it's a big information here. I just want to see if there's anything I missed. I don't think so. If I have, I'm sorry. I'll have to do it another time. Let me just quickly go through these comments again, see if I missed anything. There was one from Anne. Just trying to find it. Okay, so just back to Anne's. I have a client preparing first IVF in 6 to 8 weeks due to unexplained fertility. I just want to talk a little bit about unexplained fertility. So I'm not a fertility practitioner, but surprisingly, quite a bit of my clients have been recommended to me with unexplained fertility, or at least some issues around fertility. And there's a very interesting pattern. It's not always the same, but there's a couple of interesting patterns of unexplained fertility. And it generally has to do with some emotional charge that they're holding on. So, for example, one of them would be about the shape and changes of my body. I have one particular person that I know who had pretty healthy body, pretty healthy physiology is what I mean, and they couldn't get pregnant, and they couldn't get pregnant with a lot of IVF as well, and then they left that. And one of the things was this particular girl was a strong fitness fanatic, and the underlying fear of becoming pregnant and that getting in the way of her fitness routine and the changes in her body was a huge deal. So that was one, for example. Another example was about not being able to be supported in life post-pregnancy. And also the partner generally has some sort of hesitations about pregnancy. These things always explain, not always, sorry, these things generally do explain some aspects of infertility that they say it's unexplained. But anyway, coming back to the question, her bloods have just shown a very high prolactin reading. Apart from the recommended methods to reduce prolactin, I wonder, does yin Tang affect the pituitary gland? Okay, so this is a good question. So the question is if yin Tang, so all the practitioners would know what that is, but if we have non-acupuncturists on the webinar, so you know that third eye kind of point that we sort of learn in very early on. Does yin Tang affect the pituitary? I wonder why you're asking me that, Anne. So I would love to know your thoughts on that in terms of its connection to the pituitary. But I'll tell you something else. One of the best things for tapping into the pituitary gland is actually via the yin chow and the yang chow mai from the 8 extras. So both the yin chow and the yang chow, they start on the heel. So that's what they call heel stance or heel motility, the heel stance vessels. So they both come from the heel and they end in the inner and outer canthus of the eye. But the internal branch through the brain, they actually crisscross, right? There's a crisscross. So as they actually crisscross behind the optic nerve, generally at the level of the hypothalamus. And so the yin and yang chow have a strong association to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So I would be inclined to try working with the 8 extras for the prolactin, but also to access and tap into the pituitary gland. So the yin and yang chow really govern the brain a lot in the 8 extra channels thing. Obviously, the Du-mai is a big one as well, because it goes in through Du-16 into the brain and comes out through Du-20 on top of the brain. But the yin and yang chow specifically, they merge and cross just at the area of the hypothalamic area behind the optic nerve. So the optic chiasm, basically what it is, that's basically what the channels are doing. So yeah, I would try to be using the yin and yang chow and see if that relates to your pattern of disharmony. Hope that answers that. Okay, let me just see if there's any other comments. Pauline, brilliant. Yes, thank you. You're welcome. Heiko, it's cutting out. We did that. Makes perfect sense. Tina, thank you. We said, Danielle said, of course, anxiety is just excitement without breath. The word anxiety, interesting enough, actually comes from angira, which means to strangle yourself. And so when you're anxious, you're literally strangling yourself. And the tremors that you're feeling is a neurological intelligence for your body to break up the clumps of stagnation so you don't essentially implode, right? So you don't have a panic attack. So you go through the tremors because it's trying to siphon out the muscular contractions and the spasms. But essentially it means the strangulation. You're strangling yourself. But thanks for bringing that up. Vidya says, amazing, Sohial, beautiful explanation. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Wendy Ryan, thank you so much, Sohial. So insightful. I got to go as kids are calling. Yep, thank you for being here. So Sohial, oh yeah, we said the book. Anne says, so is this why familial patterns carry on to next generations, unprocessed trauma? Okay, so unprocessed trauma in the viewpoint of Chinese medicine is generally from that thing that I said about the root shen, the ben shen. But in terms of channels, we're looking at the Chong Mai. So yeah, if that was the part I was talking about, the Chong Mai is the avenue to bring into the polarities of yin and yang, so the ren and du. So the Chong Mai separates, like that single cell separates into yin and yang, and the ancestral information comes with it into the parents, right? So yes, the ancestral information or past life information can be tapped into according to Chinese medicine, or at least some interpretation of it through the Chong Mai. Loving this, but need to leave for 8 o'clock. Thank you, Lisa. And because it regulates the hormone itself, the hormone production itself. I'm not sure about that. Hi, Sohial. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. Where can we get information about your other webinars? Thank you, Carol. If you're on this list now, so if you've been registered to this, I'll be sending out future webinar links so you'll get it. Thank you, Tina, for being here. Natasha, thank you for your brilliance. I'm in awe at how easily all this falls in your tongue. Thank you, Natasha. Appreciate that. Vidya, can we ask more questions related to this topic via email? Yeah, by all means. So if you have any other questions, guys, shoot me some emails. And if I get enough emails, I'll do another webinar. Because even this one was only about 7 or 8 questions I covered because I knew it was going to be long. It was like an hour and a half. So by all means, send me that. You're welcome, Yvette. Thank you. And Anne says, is there a replay? Yes, I'll send you the replay in 1 or 2 days, guys. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for being here. And if you have any other questions, please send them to me. I'll do another webinar by all means. I want to start doing a few of my actual workshops in webinar platforms just because we can't do anything, so we might as well take advantage of it. So yeah, I'll do that probably on webinar sometime. But I want to do another one on this Q&A. I really like this.